strength as it moves further away from the Luzon landmass.
The town of Dingalan in Aurora was one of the first areas to feel the wrath of then Super Typhoon Karding. Big waves were seen as early as Sunday afternoon.
Itong Typhoon Karding lang ay hindi nagtagal yung ulan, pero sobrang lakas. Kaya po hindi ho tayo nagkaroon ng malawakang flash flood. Pero storm surge, based po sa pag-ikot ko kagabi, matindi po compare po sa Ulysses.
And President Bongbong Marcos led an aerial inspection of typhoon-affected areas today.
I think that we may have gotten lucky at least this time a little bit. You might think that we overdid it. There's no such thing as overkill when it comes to disasters. So tama ito. You put everything in place and kahit mabuti na yung sobra kaysa sa kulang.
President Bongbong Marcos considers Super Typhoon Karding's damage to lives and property minimal, all things considered. He credits it to a government that he said is prepared and a country that he said may have gotten lucky. Of course, the Philippines was not as fortunate in the past, like during Tropical Storm Ondoy, which happened exactly 13 years ago today. So we're left with preparedness. We discuss just how ready we are when the next disaster strikes in this episode of The Chiefs. Welcome to The Chiefs. Ako po si Roby Alampay. Kasama ko po sa studio Ed Lingao of One News. We're here in Mandaluyong. Kasama natin online from Manila, Ami Pamintuan of the Philippine Star, and in Quezon City, Luchi Cruz-Valdes of News 5. Chiefs.
Hello, good evening.
Happy
Monday.
Happy Monday.
Happy Monday.
Yeah, all things considered, di ba?
We made it.
But of course, siyempre, sa Metro Manila, everybody's heaving a sigh of relief. But siyempre, we see the reports coming from the different provinces, Bulacan, Quezon, Nueva Ecija, lots of damage to agriculture. Ano pang na-monitor nyo, Ami?
Well, kawawa naman yung namatay na 5 rescuer sa Bulacan, ano? On top of, well, kinokulate pa yung ibang mga deaths eh. Pero yun yung medyo standing out na tragedy in this typhoon.
Yeah, it's a sober reminder, di ba? Madaling magpasalamat tayo dito sa Metro Manila, but it's a sober reminder na meron talaga mga tinamaan. Ed, speaking of tinamaan, ano pang mga impact ng na-monitor mo?
Well, of course, some concern over the impact on rice harvests. Kasi ang tinamaan is Central Luzon. You're looking at Nueva Ecija, which is the #1 producer of palay in the country. Of course, also Central Luzon is the #1 producer in terms of regions of the country. Mga 17-16% yan for the entire country. And #1 yan, of course, is Nueva Ecija, kung saan tinamaan din ng Karding. I don't know if we have the data already, pero mukhang wala pa naman. Yun lang. There are a lot of concerns over whether or not prices of rice or palay will be stable.
Kanina, well, initial assessment ng NDRRMC, kausap natin kanina Mr. Alejandro, sinabi niya 160 million yung damage na inaano. And then lots of scenes, lots of videos of farmers na walang magawa, di ba? Even before the typhoon hit, talagang tinitingnan, nakatulala na lang doon sa alam nilang tatamaan.
It's just about harvest season.
Yeah, October 5, di ba? Literally, it's not even harvest season. They knew the harvest day. Anyway, a lot of this talking about disasters, but also preparedness. We will speak to our first guest after a short break. Keep it right here on One News. After each calamity, the country's response to disaster gets an assessment again. After Karding's onslaught, we talk about risk reduction again. Joining us this evening, Senator Sonny Angara. Welcome to the Chiefs, Senator Angara.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Roby and Ed, and Ami and Luchi, and to all the viewers. Good evening. I hope everyone is safe in their homes.
Sa inyo rin po, kukumustahin nga natin din namin ng Aurora, but also that's also by way of just pointing out, you've been pushing for the creation of a disaster, the Department of Disaster Resilience. There's a lot of talk kung kailangan bang disaster, upgrade na lang ang NDRRMC, but maybe when things like this are happening, and as this happened over the weekend, what was going through your mind?
Well, of course, we're still waiting for the data. Mentioned was yung tinamaan yung food supply natin Central Luzon. That's already shrinking as it is over the long term, yung land that we plant to agriculture. So it's really a cause for concern anytime this part of the country is hit. No? So hindi naman natin iniisip masyado yung bill on the department at the moment. But I suppose in the coming days and weeks, siguro pag-uusapan yan. Dahil in the last decade, I think there have been arguments for the creation of a full-time department rather than just a council where it's the existing agencies and there is no full-time department dedicated to disaster mitigation or disaster reduction.
But sir, how
Of
different
course, the fact that today was also the anniversary of Ondoy has not escaped, people's notion that let's just say 12 years hence ay ganito pa rin tayo, 13 years. No? What is your assessment of our response and how we feel every time we're faced with an oncoming calamity, as it were? No?
Well, I think maybe since Ondoy, there have been some improvements, Luchi. No? I think we were able to evacuate people better this time if you compare it to that time. Of course, the damage is still there. No, in my province alone, you're talking about hundreds of homes destroyed, and I think the report is thousands of homes, partially at least, damaged. No? So that's something that we have to look at, whether it's innovations in how we do, not only in how we react to disasters, but also maybe in how we build our homes and where we build our homes. Of course, since Ondoy, we nauso yung mga disaster mapping, di ba? And we're supposed to put our communities where they're out of harm's way. So that's something that we have to look at if we've been following that blueprint since then.
And of course, si President Marcos, he congratulated the preparedness especially of the local government units. Pero at the same time, sabi niya, we may have been lucky this time. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yes, I think we were expecting a much worse storm, no? Because yung winds were up to 200 kilometers, which really would have been, and I think it weakened as it hit the eastern seaboard. Pero kung talagang it hit us with full force in all the provinces, then I think the damage would have been worse. So tama yung I think that's the context for the president's statement. Tama po yan. We were lucky. I think nag-weekend, nag-slow down. So I think a lot of areas were damaged, but a lot of areas were also spared a worse fate. No. So I think that's correct. Oh.
Sir, a lot of talk about
luck, and how much of it was really preparedness? I mean, how would you weigh our performance in terms of what
preparedness preparedness is very important. You have a point there, Luchi, no? And I think our local governments and in fairness to the NDRIMC, or the National Disaster Risk Reduction Council, there were meetings already 24 hours, even 48 hours, I think, before the storm was about to hit. That's why a lot of the warnings were disseminated online and even in areas perhaps that don't have internet. It reached the barangay level. So I think that's something that deserves to be commended. sometimes the worst storms are the ones that are not predicted, di ba? So, tama rin yung sinabi na there's no such thing as an overkill in terms of preparation, because there's a bit of luck involved, but also we cannot leave things to luck. No, we have to be prepared.
Sir, a lot of talk about how the Sierra Madre supposedly broke the back of Karding. I'd like to ask you about that. Of course, it's not your specialization, but you are familiar, coming from Aurora, you are familiar with the Sierra Madre and that area facing the Pacific Ocean. How different is it this time compared to previous storms and typhoons that also passed the same track? But parang this time, nalusaw yung bagyo compared to, well, almost all storms that go through Luzon pass through Aurora and Central Luzon, except when they pass through the Bicol area.
Yes, that's correct, Ed. No? Well, definitely, I think the Sierra Madre plays a big role in terms of mitigating the damage. So if you have, but not only the Sierra Madre, even the mangroves along the coast. If we have a lot of mangroves along the Pacific Ocean, that really, there have been storms in the past where I can say that those really saved us, because from experience, the more forested areas in Aurora and Nueva Ecija received less damage in those storms. Itong storm, I'm still collating the data, so I think it's a little too early to assess. But I think in general, the forested areas, those we planted with mangroves, those really act as a storm breaker or a storm mitigator in terms of damage. So there were storms in the past where the less forested areas lost power and really were hit, but whereas the more forested areas were tended to avoid the greater damage. No?
But sir, has there been a marked increase in forest cover and mangrove planting in the last few years that makes this a particularly unique event?
I have to see the data, Ed. I know we have a greening program every year under the DNR. Whether it has actually increased our forest cover, because there's also some denudation, I suppose. No, it's a plus minus. So hopefully there is one, but we'll have to ask the DNR as to the forest cover. No, but Aurora is lucky because I think it has 50 to 60% forest cover. That's it's either one or two, along with Palawan. So that definitely helps in terms of storm mitigation. So maybe in provinces like Nueva Ecija that are often hit, we should also plant more trees. I think I saw some photos today of the damage to some areas. So I think one we should be looking at maybe more strategic tree planting there.
Yeah, speaking of strategy, we were so close to Harvest Week. Kawawa naman yung mga magsasaka, kita natin. I mean, even before the typhoon struck, literally just taking videos of their crops and telling people, wala kaming magagawa, nag-aantay lang kami ng salanta dito. Coming from an agricultural area as well, that's part of a big granary and food basket for the Philippines. Is there any way for the agriculture sector specifically to have more resilience? I mean, how do we protect that? I mean, on its own, separate from all the considerations, of course, natali-tali, but specifically looking at our food supply, how do we become stronger and more protected there?
That's a very, very good and urgent question, given the food security concerns in the world and in the country today, Roby. But I think technology may hold some of the answers there. I think in harvesting, it's not really a new technology, but remote sensing, meaning really harnessing technology to know when storms will hit. Then you time your harvests before that storm will hit. You harvest before that. That was technology that we were investing in the 2010s. I have to look what happened. I know it was pioneered in some state colleges like Don Mariano Marcos, I think, in Ilocos, and in not sure if La Union also did it. But it's something that we should be looking at more, because if it's a smaller investment to save a larger investment, then it makes sense.
So what about going back to the first question? Are you not going to resurrect your proposal for a Department of Disaster Resilience or Management? And how would that, in the context of the PDRMMC or the NDRMC, what would be a better option, to put up a new department altogether or to improve on the existing government agencies?
Well, the argument for Luchi is to have a full-time department. That's all they do. No, they prepare, they pre-position, they prepare the relief goods, they supervise the evacuation of the local government units. But the cons, I suppose, is the cost of putting up a department and having officials all over the country, whereas versus utilizing the existing officers of DND, DSWD, and all of these other existing offices. No? So these are the things that you must, ititimbang mo yan. You have to weigh them against each other. The theory behind the NDRIMC, or the National Disaster Risk Reduction Council, is really that the different departments will be talking to each other and acting with extreme urgency in times like this. No? And in fairness, I think the DND, you've seen the DSWD, Secretary Tulfo was in Central Luzon early today. So I think so far, kahit hindi naman, it's not a life or death situation. But if you're talking about ideal situations, then we have to see. Maybe it's better that we have a full-time department.
But Senator,
but given the fiscal situation coming out of COVID, baka our money is also better spent for the moment on other things.
But Senator, it's just a fiscal question. It's just a matter of money, or I mean, I'm not saying I've heard anything to the contrary, or I'm not suggesting anything, but not being a political animal and not necessarily knowing how things work. Is there also political dynamics here, as always? Let's say between local governments and national authorities. Is there something to be considered there?
Hindi naman siguro. I don't think so. Maybe in isolated cases, but in general, I think nakikinig naman yung local governments, national government, and they work well together because at the local level, there's also the local disaster risk reduction councils, no? And they're supposed to activate, and they're supposed to be the first line of defense. So these don't work at loggerheads naman. In theory, they're supposed to work together. So I don't think there is a problem, unless usually you see the problem is in the giving out of relief goods. Diyan minsan nagkakaaway yung mayors and sometimes the national agencies, no, in the past. But in general, they work well together, I think.
Senator, kumusta yung province mo? We understand Aurora has been one of the hardest hit by the typhoon. And by way of preparedness, what do you think could have been done better? By way of
Well, I think okay naman yung preparedness ng local officials. I think they nag-evacuate those close to the sea, and but still the damage to property and to crops and to fishing boats was quite substantial, I think. No, you're talking about hundreds of fishing boats damaged and thousands of houses, particularly in two towns, San Luis and Dingalan. This is in the southern part of the province. And for crop damage naman, we're talking about half the province was hit in terms of your crop damage. So we're still gathering information, and then we hope to be able to help those who need the help most.
So by way of preparedness, what else do you think can be done?
Well, oftentimes it's a pre-positioning of goods because like now there are some roads which are not passable. So I have to monitor the situation on the ground kung umaabot yung relief goods to those who need it. No? There are about 2 roads I'm told that are not passable right at the moment. So we'll be monitoring that situation going forward kasi it's important to get relief goods to the people there.
Pero sir, beyond evacuation and beyond the distribution of relief goods, di ba we also have to plan long term in terms of how we meet these challenges of climate. for example, whether or not we should be burying power lines and telecommunications cables, and whether the hazardous areas should be evacuated permanently, or whether the people should be allowed to. I mean, we've seen Project NOAA, we've seen the results. At the same time, it's also been largely ignored. And people still live in dangerous areas. So we have that. I mean, yes, on one hand, there is some preparedness in terms of, I suppose, evacuation. But on the other hand, parang we keep preparing every year, but we keep making the same mistakes.
Yeah, I think, but somehow we get better also. Like if we have the right data and we have the right equipment, so I suppose we should be investing, as you mentioned, Project NOAA. That's when the government really started investing in technology, using technology to predict a lot of using science to predict a lot of these disasters. No? So that trend should definitely continue. All these things that help us react better, I think that's worth investing in. And sustainability should be at the core of everything we do, really. So you mentioned also the power lines, etc. So maybe we should think about satellite rather, because every time you have these disasters, then your phone lines are down, your power lines are down. So we have to think past next generation technologies in terms of to make them also disaster proof or disaster resilient.
Senator, baliktarin ko yung tanong ko tungkol sa the proposed Department for Disaster Resilience. Baliktarin ko yung tanong. As much as they try to do with the mechanism and the resources that they have, ano yung limitations ng NDRRMC system natin?
Well, they have to use, I guess, the existing people on the ground that they have. If there's a permanent department, then maybe those people are already stationed. Although, pagka may yung ibang departments naman, DILG, DND, usually may tao rin yan sa probinsya. So, although they may be outperforming other duties, I guess the theoretical benefit of having a permanent department is having people really boots on the ground, so to speak, who are doing nothing else but preparing and monitoring and doing relief.
Off the cuff, of course, Secretary Tulfo is saying, for example, that we can start with building evacuation centers in LGUs, no? And having to stop using schools nga naman, and compounding the problem when the disaster has passed and we're trying to get back to normal. At least man lang doon, can we at least set aside funds for that?
Yeah, I think we should.
Yeah, to lessen the pathetic situation in evacuation centers right now, where people are sleeping on the floor, and sometimes we know that there are not enough toilets and stuff like that. Doon man lang, Senator, pwede ba mag-umpisa ron?
Yes, actually, if you're talking about that kind of infrastructure, you might as well be talking about sanitation as well and proper water facilities, because you want to prevent the spread of disease. No? So definitely, that's a good point by Secretary Erwin Tulfo, that we need maybe better facilities nationwide. No? So he could pinpoint perhaps the areas also where these are most needed, and then maybe the funding could be a cooperative effort between local and national governments, because there are some cities which have excess funding, especially with the Mandanas Doctrine, and they could maybe set aside some funds for that. And whereas the national government can take care of the lesser equipment municipalities in terms of fiscal space, no, yung mga maybe 5th, 6th class municipalities, poorer provinces, the more disaster-prone areas, maybe Bicol, among others, no. Could get a lot of help from the national government.
Speaking of funding, sinertify tonight ni President Marcos yung appropriations bill as urgent. Ano nang status ng bill in the Senate?
Well, the Constitution mentions that the bill should really originate from the House. So the House is hearing it, and the certification of urgency by the President is crucial because then the House can approve it on second and third reading on the same day. Tapos kami naman, we began our budget briefings last week. So we've had a handful of agencies and we're continuing and we break from our session. This is our last week of session, Amino and Luchi. But after that, despite the break, the Senate will still be having their budget briefings even through the break. So we can pass the budget hopefully in time and have a new budget by January 1, which is always the goal every year.
Sir, apart from passing it on time, how much scrutiny do you expect the Senate to give this? I'll take advantage of you being here to ask specifically about yung request ni Vice President Sara Duterte for confidential intelligence funds, both for the Office of the Vice President as well as for the Department of Education. As you know, at the House of Representatives, practically no questions, out of courtesy. I mean, what is the attitude of our senators on that item?
Well, I think the DBM already granted that request because they put it in the National Expenditure Program, Roby. It's there. I think there's an amount set aside in the DepEd as well as in the Office of the Vice President. So traditionally, the Senate also gives deference to the Office of the President, the Office of the Vice President, the Judiciary, the Constitutional Commissions, and these offices which of high officials because out of respect also to their office, but it does not mean that their funds are beyond scrutiny. But just out of respect, and usually na comment is the OVP is actually institutionally medyo lugi siya compared because the Office of the President, for instance, you have a residence, you have vehicles, yung Office of the Vice President doesn't have a permanent office. So even si Senator Nancy Binay noted that during the time of her father, former Vice President Jejomar Binay, they had to look for offices, they had to look around for funding, so it wasn't easy. So I think going forward, I think both the Senate and the House want to strengthen the OVP as an institution, maybe to give it a permanent O, to make sure its employees are in the same place, so to enhance its operational efficiencies.
Pero sir,
but we're not talking about. We're not talking about.
I'm sorry.
But sir, isn't it true that intelligence and confidential funds are practically beyond scrutiny? I mean, no matter how we describe it and look at it, in the end, the COA will only receive reports from the agencies on how they say they spent these funds. They do not have to provide receipts. So in other words, they just have to take the word of the agencies.
Sorry, let me just tack on to that. You mentioned strengthening the institution, but these are confidential intelligence funds. I mean, it's not like this goes to staff. It's not like it supports.
Yes, sir. It's not allowed. It's not allowed to be used for staffing under the joint circular of COA and DBM in 2015.
Confidential, I'm really not sure where people spend the confidential fund because some have used it to buy equipment, some have used it to, but usually the cover or the guise of security concerns or national security. That's why it's deemed confidential. But in this case, I think maybe because the Vice President was formerly a mayor of Davao and had the use of confidential funds, perhaps she's used to that kind of setup, no?
Yeah, but I guess ang tanong po ng maraming tao is bakit ito ipapaubaya sa respeto na lang? I mean, we can express respect. I understand that. But I think there are many ways to express respect. If you need this big of a budget, that's fine, but maybe convert it to line items.
Yeah, pwedeng respect with receipt.
Apart from a point also raised that this also open. I mean, let's leave aside muna the person of Vice President Sara Duterte, but the office itself. But this does create a precedent. I mean, this is something that's unprecedented, providing intelligence funds for the office of the Vice President, and that basically sets practice for all Vice Presidents down the line. I can understand respect, but is this particular item something, precisely given that, as you yourself said, kayo mismo hindi nyo alam paano ginagamit ang confidential intelligence funds?
I don't know if it's the first time, Roby, the office has been given. I think I was told in the past it was given, and even the DepEd was given confidential funds during the time of Pinoy. So it's not unprecedented in that sense, no. It's just that it's not a recurring thing. I guess it depends on the request of the agency also. If they make a request, then
Yes,
it may
sir.
or it may not be granted. In this case, it was granted by the DBM or the Department of Budget and Management.
Yes, sir. Well, sir, of course, we understand that. But in the end, diba, it is Congress that will have to scrutinize whatever the DBM asks for. In other words, the ball will be in your court.
Yes,
the
certainly.
DBM
That's
can
correct. You're
ask, and
correct.
it's up to Congress.
Yeah, or more to the point, how much of what the Congress will decide will also pass through the Senate and be carried? I mean, because, we've been told that once a budget is approved at committee level, that's basically it. So the question is whether the Senate will do its job in fiscalizing and really scrutinize it more, and hopefully, make some amendments if necessary. Will you be doing that?
Yes, I believe so, Luchi. No? That's the tradition in the Senate. Since I've been there since 2013. I've been a vice chair or a chair since I don't remember, 16 or 17, something like that. So I've seen that the budget really goes through a lot of scrutiny in the Senate, and just because the House passed it doesn't mean that the Senate necessarily adopts it. No? If it's in its view, there are reasons to realign certain items, because that's basically what we do at our level. No, we don't have a blank slate. We look at what is already funded in terms of the National Expenditure Program or the bill passed by Congress. But it's not unusual for big changes to be made. That's why the BICAM sometimes takes some time, because it's difficult to reconcile what the House and the Senate have passed. So it's never an easy thing, but I don't expect the Senate to do differently from what was done in previous Senates.
So sinabi na nga ni VP Sara, she's leaving it up to Congress to decide kung pagbibigyan nga yung confidential funds niya. So you're saying the sentiment is in the Senate is similar to the House, na out of respect, pagbibigyan siya.
We'll have to wait for the actual hearing. No? We'll be having that in a few days or weeks' time. But I suspect, of course, you give due deference also to the Office of the President, the Office of the Vice President. We had our hearing for the Supreme Court, the Judiciary, and you also give due deference to the requests of a co-equal branch, whether it's the executive, kasi we're in a tripartite form of government, diba? It's not just the Congress, although Congress has the main job of scrutinizing funds and fiscalizing. We also have to work with the executive and with the judiciary. So we give due respect to their request.
Okay. Senator Sonny Angara. Sir, maraming salamat po sa oras ninyo.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Roby,
Senator.
Ami, and Luchi. Stay safe. Thank you very much for having me.
And we'll start up another conversation right after the break. Please stay with us. The Chiefs will be right back.
Ondoy was at the weaker tropical storm category, but it poured up to 455 millimeters in Metro Manila.
hangin kasi yung measure ng bagyo. So, hindi mo magsukat sa lakas ng hangin yung lakas ng ulan. So, hindi siya directly correlated. So, pwede pa rin na maraming ulan isang bagyo kahit mahina yung hangin niya.
State Weather Bureau Pagasa said, Ondoy brought almost 500 millimeters of rain in a span of 24 hours.
Siniksik ni Ondoy sa loob ng lamang po ng 6 na oras. Kung tutusin, parang ang haba po ng gabing yon. Pero katubos po ng isang buwang ulan na naging sanhi ng pagkabatay ng halos 500 katao.
Ondoy, Yolanda, Pepeng, Ulysses, Odette, these are just some of the most powerful typhoons to hit the Philippines in the last decade. How much has changed in the country's disaster preparedness since then? We ask Angelo Kairos Dela Cruz. He's the Deputy Executive Director of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities. Sir, welcome to the Chiefs and thank you for joining us tonight.
Magandang gabi po sa inyong lahat. And thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. Well, sir, a lot of people are talking about yung biglaang pagbilis at paglakas ni Karding nung weekend. That was really surprising for a lot of people. Now, I suppose it's not the first time we've had what they call an explosive or rapid intensification of a typhoon, but it appears that it's getting more and more often. Parang dumadalas. What could be the reason behind this? I think we lost him. Oh, yeah. Yes, sir. Sir, did you hear, sir?
I mean, the science is quite... Yeah, climate. Yeah, I heard you fine.
Yes, sir.
And I apologize for the unstable internet connection. But I do think that the science is really clear. Climate change is supercharging the typhoons that we're getting here in the Philippines. We correlate the numbers of typhoon as early on that climate change is supercharging them. So we might get less, but we're definitely getting more harsher typhoons here in the Philippines.
Okay. Well, sir, I also saw some studies. There was a study in 2018 by a group from Princeton and a study by MIT in 2016. Yung Yolanda type of typhoons daw, yung category 5, 190 mph, miles per hour, used to come once every 8 years. But by 2081, that's 60 plus years from now, it's going to come every year unless we change the way we do things. What exactly are we looking at? What kind of a change are we looking at that's necessary to stop this?
Yeah, in terms of burden of doing something, first, the Philippines, I would like to make it very clear, the Philippines, a very low emitting country compared to the global average, but it does not mean that we shouldn't do something about our global emissions, our share in the global emissions. But definitely, in the upcoming conference of parties in Egypt, developed countries should start providing more clear climate action on the table. For example, we have loss and damage finance. Developed countries have to be quite clear about their mitigation targets, about how they plan to change the way they run their industries, and so on. And this is not rocket science. I mean, the science is really clear. We have a list of countries. We have the list of industries that are emitting more than the ideal carbon emissions. So it's for us as a developing country, we should do our part, but at the same time, we should add more pressure to the rest of the globe that they should also do more.
Mr. Kairos, sabi ng Pag-asa, sea levels in the Philippines are rising 3 times faster than the global average. Is this accurate, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, definitely po, that's true, no? And I think we have some of the best climate scientists here in the Philippines, especially in Pag-asa and in our local academic institutions. The global average po, yes, it's true in the Philippines, the identify communities that would be, projects. We should go beyond looking at just, waiting for a typhoon to happen and doing something about it. We should be more proactive.
What about yung reclamation projects in Manila Bay? Kasi tuloy-tuloy pa rin eh. And anong impact nun?
I mean, we should refer back to science. No? I think we have a lot of report that says that reclamation will not help at all it will only create a facade that we're being safe because we have, we're trying to build more walls. And yet in Metro Manila alone, the land is literally sinking below sea level by the year, right? And if we don't start talking about this holistically, if we don't start talking about beyond, something that they plan to build, which I trust would be really beautiful, but if we don't go beyond that, and if you don't start looking at this in a more comprehensive manner, you talk about urban poor, you talk about industries, you talk about old communities, and so on, we will be missing the point forever.
Speaking of looking at it comprehensively, being driven by science and data, may kausap ako recently, and we're old enough to remember when ang ano namin, yung mga bagyo sa north, lalo na Batanes, and we actually had this image, this thought na for some reason Visayas and Mindanao hindi yan dinadaanan ng bagyo or hindi tinatamaan ng malakas. But by now we get the impression na parang bumababa na parang wala nang safe. Does the data, is that actually backed up by data? Does the data actually show na wala nang safe zone dito sa Philippines? Lahat pantay-pantay na tayo.
Yeah, science is quite clear that climate change creates more variability. So, for example, the days were gone, and I agree with you. Before people in Mindanao, some of my friends, they usually don't mind typhoons because hindi tumatama sa Mindanao. But now it's gonna happen more often, and the variability is gonna be really wild. That people would usually, if we don't pay enough attention, we would be catch off guard.
Of course, many people are pointing to the role of Sierra Madre today or last night, and that it saved the day for us, apparently. But of course, we also know about the state of the Sierra Madre Mountains, especially we're talking about the longest mountain range in the Philippines. So tell us about how, for example, for ordinary citizens like me, what can we really realistically do in terms of, aside from making calls for, the reforestation of Sierra Madre, what is it that we can really do on a day-to-day basis to strengthen what's there that can be strengthened and, to generally help the situation as far as climate change and our vulnerabilities are concerned?
Yeah, thank you. And that's a question that we usually get now. And I won't add up. We treat it as really trivial when we put the burden to consumers, for example. You should stop consuming this because this is bad for the environment. And I think that's creating a false narrative at some point because it removes the burden from the real movers, right? From industries, from the government, from developed country governments, and so on. And don't get me wrong, I do believe we should start goods that are not degrading the environment in their supply lines, in the supply chain. But I think as people, what we should do is to demand more accountability. For example, in the Philippines, and this is not going to be the end of it, for example, here in the Philippines, we're getting a lot of financing tagged as climate change related, and it's getting implemented on the ground, but I don't think people know that they're actually receiving climate funds. And big corporations and the developed countries are reporting them basically as tax incentives at some point. So I think as people, I would just add on to that point that accountability should be something we should be championing and driving forward.
What's the gap now when we go to, we have the technology, we have policy, but what's the gap between policy and technology, the knowledge that we have, with what's actually happening on the ground? Kanina nabanggit nga ni Senator Angara, all over the country, may disaster mapping tayong lahat. It's down to the barangay level. Everybody knows where the danger zones are, saan magfa-flood, saan pwede mag-mudslide, saan malakas ang bagyo, and so on. And yet, every time our people are still caught in danger zones and so on. Is there a gap there, or is just that na pick your poison lang talaga ang Pilipinas ngayon? Wala na talaga pwedeng takbuhan ng mga tao?
No, I think the gap is basically can be found on the way we treat climate change, and at some extent, disaster management. We treat it as a separate sector, so we tend, to put all our brains, but just on a single plan. So as part of our work in the Institute for Climate and Sustainable what we keep on saying, climate action should be directly related to our development trajectory, so that people won't feel like they're being penalized for something that they are doing. For example, there's a lot of people are living on the coastlines, and the DNR would say, those are red zones, dapat walang tao dyan. But then, human nature and survival and thriving, it becomes a really complex issue. So as long as we keep on treating climate change as a sector or as a chapter plan change in the next few years here in the Philippines, that really we're approaching the problem, in a wrong way.
Can you give us more details about the climate financing? You were mentioning na hindi siya nakakarating dun sa dapat na bigyan, ano? What do you think can be done to make it more accessible? Coming as it is, the funds are coming from overseas. Paano siya? Ano yung mali sa sistema, and what can be done to fix it?
I think the fundamental flaw on that, first, is that no one is looking at the field. It's an open data, but no one is paying enough attention. So, for example, right now, as we're talking, if I remember it right, we have around like $8 billion of climate finance, climate change tagged financing here in the Philippines. At some point, they are accounted, but they are not checked whether they're actually contributing to our climate action, to our direction, collective direction as a country, in terms of climate action. So yung figures ko na yun, yung pera na yun, nakakalat everywhere. And as I said, no one is just paying enough attention to that. And I think there's also a time that everything is being tagged as climate change related. So for example, we're tagging medical supplies, X-ray machines for some time as climate change related. And it gives us a feeling in the national level that we're actually providing finance, but we're providing finance for the wrong stuff. And we're counting it as climate change.
Who can access it ba? Private sector, NGO, government? Sino bang pwede?
Yeah, for international financing, the data is available online. It's under the Overseas Economic website ng OECD. For the Philippines, I think it's just scattered. There's no single reporting mechanism right now. And I think the Department of Finance and the Climate Change Commission would play a huge role in consolidating those data sets.
I'm just curious because, there's always this push and pull between industries and then, domestic consumers. No? Let's say, for example, in terms of the pollution levels, the industries would say, if you look at Pasig River, for example, 90% of the waste there is domestic. And only 10% comes from industrial waste. Ditto for many others, reforestation. 80% of that is really just these farmers who cut trees for fire. So ano ba talaga yung hindi mo na malaman eh. So when you say it's industries misleading people or taking advantage of the vulnerability of the ordinary citizen, etc., where, how much weight or how much burden should we put on ordinary citizens to know that each one has a role to play here? In mitigating the damage to environment.
Yeah. Let me take a step back. I think, since we started yung climate change discussion in the Philippines, what we keep on missing, and even NGOs are guilty of that, is that having a proper way of communicating. We have a failure of communication. That we have to wait for a disaster to happen before we start talking about climate change or disaster management. And I think the same thing for with consumers. Yung choice in choosing between which products to buy and so on. I think it's a whole of government, it's a whole of society question. It's just that I think putting the burden on a single segment of the public of the consumer side is just really flawed. No? It won't do any good in the long run. I just think we should start approaching it as I've said, a whole of government, as a whole of society approach.
But I'm glad you mentioned communication. I remember, of course, our good friend, colleague, idol, boss, Dan De Padua, saying before, I remember saying, yung bokabularyo ng Pilipino lumalaki with every disaster. Diba? Now, alam natin ang tsunami. Ngayon, alam natin ang storm surge. Diba? And we collect. But climate change...
Explosive intensification
diba?
today.
Parang, but climate change doesn't translate to any particular, it's not one event. It's not, diba? Parang it's still very nebulous. And to your point, actually, isang tanong ko nga, have we even translated it into Filipino? I mean, meron ba tayong ginagamit na term? Essentially, it goes back to the same question as Luchi. How do we communicate climate change when we cannot communicate climate change?
Yeah, there are a lot of efforts. No? For example, my organization published a climate anthology book that tries to translate climate change and its impacts to local dialects and other languages across the globe and here in the Philippines.
Sample nga, I mean, what are some terms that we're using for climate change?
Ano siya? Climate change sa Tagalog.
Yeah, I think the first agreement of that exercise is to just agree that translating climate change, for example, in Tagalog, it won't do much.
Wala eh.
What we should be focused on translating is a discussion on vulnerabilities. For example, if you talk to a farmer, don't talk to him about projections 50 years from now, if he has to figure out the next planting cycle, right? So I think yung discussion of vulnerabilities should be the main focus instead of translating the language. And I think it's an exercise being excellently done, for example, by our local academic institutions. We had the opportunity to partner with some of the best ones: Benguet State University, Visayas State University, University of Southeastern Philippines, and Xavier University. And they try to help us, translate, for example, what does it mean for climate and disaster risk finance and insurance to a banana farmer, for example, in Panabo, Davao. Right? And those things we're quite excited about. Because if people finally realize, climate change is affecting me beyond typhoons, it's actually threatening, my access to clean water. It's threatening, it's forcing me to change, for example, my labor hours, because a 1 degree increase in our ambient temperature would mean, for example, 30% more heat stroke and so on. So yung vulnerabilities, I think yung kailangan i-communicate. And I think, as I've said, it's a problem that we have to figure out really soon.
Well, sir, we understand your point about vulnerabilities being more tangible. But at the same time, hindi ba mas madali ring i-motivate ang tao pag merong pinag-usapang kalaban? I suppose that's why we're asking kung if there's any easy way to explain climate change to people, given that we also want to change behaviors. I mean, I think we all agree na tangible sa kanilang vulnerability.
Kailangan may kontrabida.
Pero
Lingao. Tawagan natin Lingao.
You have to identify the problem at the solution, diba?
Ayun lang, I don't know. Baka lang may ganun din palo dapat. But of course, I'm just guessing.
Yeah, I mean, some of the successes that we had with local government units and local communities is during yung planning sessions, we introduced, for example, the use of a problem and solution tree, where basically you identify a problem that you think, it's really affecting your life. So, for example, lesser income. And you try to get you try to get to the roots of the problem. And sometimes climate change would just be one part of many other sources of your problem. And we try to address each and every one of those. So I think if you're looking for an innovation, I think that's one of those. No? And there are many, many more other ways of doing it. But in my organization, ICSC, we try to approach the problem using a problem tree.
Okay. Well, Mr. Dela Cruz, mahabang usapan pa to. I mean, we're of course open and we'd like to help in any efforts to communicate and to help our people. In the meantime, maraming salamat po sa oras ninyo.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Salamat po.
Angelo Kairos Dela Cruz is Deputy Executive Director of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities. Maraming salamat po. And that is it for the Chiefs. We hope what was discussed will keep the conversation going. I'm Roby Alampay.
I'm Mami Pamintuan of the Philippine Star.
I'm Luchi Cruz-Valdes of News 5.
I'm Lingao. We are One News, all sides, all the time.